There are moments in history when truth is not defeated by argument, and it is not extinguished by force. It is buried by silence. And Mecca, in the early years of the mission of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a place where silence weighed heavier than any sword or threat. People often assume that the enemies of truth are the ignorant. But Mecca was not a city of ignorant people. That is what makes this story unsettling. The leaders of Quraysh were intelligent, experienced, eloquent, politically astute, and sharp observers. They did not lack intellect. They did not lack the ability to recognize when something was extraordinary. What they lacked was the courage to pay the price for the truth. In the depths of the night, when the Kaaba fell into stillness, footsteps moved through the darkness. They did not belong to the poor, nor to the lost. They belonged to the powerful. They did not come to pray. They did not come to mock. They did not come to debate. They came only to listen. Abu Jahl, Abu Sufyan, and Akhnas ibn Sharik, names later tied to fierce opposition against Islam. Yet on those nights, they stood hidden in the shadows, close to the house of Muhammad. Peace be upon him. No one knew they were there, and they wanted it that way. Because a single glance, a single rumor, could begin to crack the power they had spent their entire lives building. They listened to the Quran being recited at night. Not a few verses, not a short passage. They stood there for hours. Time slipped by in silence until the eastern sky began to lighten. Dawn arrived, and they turned away quickly, like people who had committed a sin they were afraid to name. And what kept them there for so long? What they heard did not resemble poetry. Muhammad, peace be upon him, was not a poet. He had never competed in the verbal contests of Quraysh. He was not a soothsayer or a mystical storyteller. He could not read. He could not write. And yet the words that echoed through that night carried a weight unlike anything they had ever known. They did not flatter the ear. They struck directly at the conscience. As they walked back in the faint light of morning, they encountered one another. All three were stunned. No one spoke first, but each of them understood. The others had done exactly the same thing. The same night, the same place, the same inner turmoil. They swore to one another that they would not return, not because the Quran had failed to affect them. Quite the opposite. It was because it affected them too deeply that they were afraid. Because if they returned, if anyone saw them standing there again, dangerous questions would begin to form in other hearts. And Quraysh did not fear losing an argument. Quraysh feared doubt. They feared the moment when people begin to ask whether what they worship is truly the truth. Truth had knocked on their hearts, but instead of opening the door, they locked it tighter. Not because they did not understand, but because they understood all too well what they would have to give up. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained. This is not a story about people who never heard the truth. This is a story about people who heard it, understood it, and still turned away. And it is right here that history begins to split into two very different paths. But while powerful hearts in Mecca chose silence to protect their status, elsewhere Allah was preparing hearts willing to be broken. Not by force, not by coercion, but through moments that were small, personal, and deeply human. Moments that, if we do not look closely, we miss the way Allah changes history. If you want to understand why Islam did not rise through miracles or armies, but through hearts willing to face the truth even at great cost, stay with this story until the end. And if you feel the depth of history in what you have just heard, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained and support us. Your support gives life to stories that have rarely been told, shared with honesty and depth. While Mecca kept its doors tightly shut, Allah continued opening other paths. Not every heart must declare faith immediately to be saved from cruelty. Some hearts do not yet profess belief, but they are no longer cruel enough to stand with injustice. And from those hearts, Allah began to shake the order that Quraysh believed was unbreakable. In the distant land of Abyssinia, the earliest Muslims stood before a king who did not share their religion. They had no army, no power, nothing to bargain with. They had only the truth, and they were compelled to speak it without knowing what would come next. When Jaafar ibn Abi Talib spoke about Jesus, the son of Mary, he did not try to please the king. He did not evade. He did not embellish. He spoke only what Islam teaches, what Muhammad, peace be upon him, had brought. This was a moment when many would choose compromise. Telling a Christian king that Jesus was not divine, that he was a prophet, was no easy thing. It could lead to exile, even destruction. But Jaafar did not retreat. Because there are moments when a person must choose between safety and truth. The negus listened. He did not see the people before him as the weak to be pitied, nor as threats to be eliminated. He listened as someone confronting his own conscience. When he bent down, picked up a small piece of wood from the ground, and said that what Muhammad brought and what Jesus brought did not differ by even this small piece, the entire court fell silent. The negus did not declare himself a Muslim in that moment. But he did something even harder for a king. He stood on the side of justice, even if it meant angering the powerful. He refused bribes. He protected people who possessed nothing but their faith. And he said words history would never forget. He would rather lose his entire kingdom than harm a single one of them. Allah does not require a heart to carry the correct label before using it to protect truth. Sometimes, conscience is the first door that leads to light. Back in Mecca, another awakening unfolded in a completely different way. Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib was not searching for religion. He was a warrior, a hunter, a symbol of strength and honor. Islam had never concerned him, but Muhammad, peace be upon him, was different. He was the nephew Hamza loved, the child he had known since youth. When Hamza heard that Muhammad had been publicly insulted by Abu Jahl, something broke inside him. Not a religious boundary, but a human one. He did not calculate consequences. He did not consider politics. He acted as someone who could not accept cowardice legitimized by power. Hamza's strike was born of honor, not faith. But that is what made the night long for him. When anger faded, Satan whispered. Hamza found himself between two worlds. On one side stood status, tradition, and the gaze of Quraysh. On the other stood a path he had just stepped onto, one he did not yet understand. He could not sleep. For the first time in his life, strength did not make him feel secure. And in that moment of vulnerability, Hamza did what few strong men dare to do. He admitted he did not know. He raised his hands and asked Allah that if this path was the truth, his heart be given peace with it. There was no thunder, no miracle, only the stillness of a heart that finally stopped resisting. When Hamza went to Muhammad, peace be upon him, and listened, he realized he was not seeking victory, but righteousness. From that moment, Hamza did not merely become a Muslim. He became proof that faith does not always begin with belief, but sometimes begins with refusing to stand with evil. At the same time, Quraysh did not realize their foundation was cracking. A distant king had stood with the weak. The most feared warrior in Mecca had crossed to the other side, not through loud calls, but through quiet choices of conscience. Allah was preparing greater changes, not through numbers, but through the quality of hearts willing to be transformed. And Mecca, unaware, stood on the edge of an unstoppable earthquake. There are men a whole city avoids when they walk by. Umar ibn al-Khattab was one of them. Tall, powerful, with a cold stare and a voice that tolerated no challenge. When Umar appeared, the air seemed to tighten. To him, everything was clear, right or wrong, loyalty or betrayal, strength or weakness. There was no room for hesitation. Yet within this man, who seemed incapable of doubt, Allah planted a seed no one could see. One night near the Kaaba, Umar heard Muhammad, peace be upon him, praying. Not out of curiosity like others, not secretly in the shadows. Umar approached directly, stood there and told himself that no matter what happened, he would listen. Not to believe, but to conclude. The words flowed, firm and solemn, unlike anything Umar had heard before. He tried to resist. The familiar thought arose. This is just poetry. And in that exact moment, the recitation denied his thought. Umar was shaken. He reassured himself that it must be the words of a soothsayer. Once again, the recitation rejected the idea. As if the words stood before him, staring into his heart, by stripping away every defense. Umar left without a word. He did not become a Muslim that night. But something changed. For the first time in his life, Umar encountered something that could not be defeated by strength or reasoning. And it disturbed him. When news spread that Hamza had accepted Islam, that discomfort turned into rage. Mecca trembled. A man Quraysh had relied on to instill fear had crossed over. To Umar, it felt like a crack in a wall he believed could never fall. If Hamza could change, nothing was safe. At Dar al-Nadwa, the discussions grew darker. For the first time, killing Muhammad, peace be upon him, was spoken of openly. Many hesitated, aware of the price of blood. But Umar stood up, without hesitation, without long calculation. In that moment, he believed there was only one way to end the chaos in his heart and in Mecca. Cut the source. He strapped on his sword. His steps were heavy and resolute. People avoided his gaze. They did not know this man was walking toward a moment that would shape all of history. On the way, Umar was stopped. The words spoken to him did not calm his anger. They redirected it. News of his sister and brother-in-law struck like a blade, not because of Islam, but because of family honor. Umar turned back, walking faster, his anger now focused. When the Quran was heard from inside that small house, Umar froze. Not in fear, but in a strange feeling. The feeling of standing before something sacred. He pushed it away. Anger surged. A blow was struck. Then blood. The blood on Fatima's face was unlike anything Umar had ever seen. It did not scream. It did not argue. It simply was. Silent, like a mirror. For the first time, Umar saw himself from the outside. A man striking his own sister because of the word Allah. In that moment, the sword in Umar's hand became meaningless. His strength no longer protected anything. He sat down. His voice changed. No commands, no threats. Only a quiet request. Let me see what you are reading. The words of Surah Taha flowed into a heart exhausted from resisting. No rebuttal, no labels, only listening. And then a wall collapsed. Not because it was attacked, but because it had long been hollow inside. Umar did not cry out of fear. He cried out of relief, because at last he no longer had to fight the truth. When he stood, the man who once made Mecca tremble was gone. Or in his place stood a man searching for his way back to the one who had long been calling him. When Umar arrived at Dar al-Arqam, the companions saw the sword. But they did not see what mattered more. A heart completely broken, ready to be rebuilt. When Umar declared his faith, it was not merely the conversion of one man. It was the moment Allah showed Mecca that when He chooses someone, no power on earth can stop it. From that moment, history no longer followed its old path. Not because Umar was strong, but because Umar allowed Allah to be stronger than his ego. Not every advance is rewarded with light. Sometimes, just as hope begins to rise, darkness descends heavier than before. When strong hearts joined Islam, Mecca refused to concede. Quraysh did not choose debate or persuasion. They chose suffocation. The valley of Shib Talib became a name history would never forget, not because of its location, but because of what happened there. A pact was written and hung inside the Kaaba, sealing cruelty in the name of tradition. No trade, no marriage, no visits, no conversation, no reconciliation, all to end only when Muhammad, peace be upon him, was handed over. With ink and parchment, Quraysh turned isolation into law and hunger into a weapon. 3 years, not days, not weeks. 3 years cut off from normal life. At first came scarcity, then hunger, then exhaustion. The cries of children at night were not from fear, but from empty stomachs. Adults looked at one another helplessly. There was no immediate miracle, no door opening in the night. Only a silence long enough to make people ask whether Allah was watching. Life outside continued. On Meccan markets still bustled. Goods changed hands. Money moved. And that normalcy sharpened the pain inside the valley. Some nights, leaves were chewed to dull hunger. At times, dried animal hides were boiled just to trick the stomach into thinking it had eaten. Some could barely stand, yet they stood firm with what Quraysh could not take away: faith. In that valley, two kinds of people became unmistakably clear. Khadijah spent every remaining part of her wealth to keep others alive. Without hesitation, without calculation, every coin, every item that could be exchanged for food was given. She did not ask how long the trial would last. She asked who was hungry today. Abu Lahab, meanwhile, spent his wealth in the opposite way. He intercepted trade caravans, raised prices beyond reach, and promised to compensate merchants for any losses. Both were spending. One was buying life, the other was paying for slow death. Allah allowed this to continue. He did not intervene immediately. He did not tear the pact apart on the first day. This silence was not abandonment. It was purification. Islam did not grow in numbers during those 3 years. It was compressed, refined, made unbreakable. Those who stood firm through that trial would never leave for any promise later. At times, small lights pierced the darkness. A sack of flour smuggled in. A relative unable to endure cruelty bringing food despite public humiliation. Some were beaten, some threatened, some mocked. Yet even these small acts reminded everyone that conscience outside the valley was not entirely dead. Quraysh believed hunger would force surrender. They did not understand that hunger does not kill faith. It kills what is false. Each day in Shib Talib taught the believers to detach from everything but Allah. When wealth, trade, and social ties vanished, only one question remained: how deeply do we believe this? When endurance reached human limits, Allah began opening cracks, not through the strength of the besieged, but through the guilt of those outside. People saw the children wasting away. They heard cries barely strong enough to rise. They realized the price of maintaining power had crossed what a society could bear without destroying itself. Before it ended, before the pact was torn down, Shib Talib fulfilled what Allah intended. It produced a generation whose faith was no longer tied to comfort. A community that learned to stand when nothing remained to hold on to. From what seemed at the lowest point, was Islam prepared to enter a new phase, stronger, purer, and unafraid of darkness. Those 3 years were not defeat. They were a foundation poured with hunger, tears, and patience rarely witnessed in history. When the valley gates finally opened, Mecca seemed to breathe again. But relief lasted only a moment. Some trials do not destroy the body. They strip away what the heart relies on most. And for Muhammad, peace be upon him, Allah prepared a lesson meant for no one else. Abu Talib aged quickly during those years, not from time, but from bearing the weight of standing between 2 worlds. He protected his nephew from every threat, blocked every plot, and carried the burden of all Mecca. But protecting a person does not mean walking their path. As illness tightened its grip, Abu Talib lay surrounded by pressure, hope, and fear. Muhammad, peace be upon him, stood beside the man who raised him. This was no debate, no argument. It was family. It was a plea laid bare. He asked nothing for himself, only a word that could open an eternal door. But Abu Talib remained silent, not because he did not understand, but because he understood the social cost too well. Some stand so close to light, they feel its warmth. Yet they stop at the threshold, not because they hate the light, but because they fear the darkness of public opinion behind them. When Abu Talib passed away, Muhammad lost not only an uncle, but his final shield against open cruelty. Mecca understood immediately. Before the pain could settle, another blow fell. Khadijah, the woman who stood beside Muhammad for 25 years, who believed when no one else did, who gave when others withheld, who sheltered him when the world turned away, also departed. Years of hunger had drained her strength. No complaints, no resentment, just a quiet departure of a woman who gave everything to this mission. In 1 year, Muhammad lost both outer protection and inner refuge. Abu Talib was the wall against social storms. Khadijah was the home where his heart rested. When both were taken, every earthly support vanished, not by accident, and certainly not as punishment. Allah does not build this mission on any one person, no matter how great. By removing each support, Allah showed the world that Islam does not exist through lineage, wealth, or patronage. It exists because Allah wills it. And Muhammad carried that burden with complete honesty. That year became known as the year of sorrow, not because suffering was new, but because loss came without pause. Quraysh seized the moment. Without Abu Talib, insults grew public, abuse harsher, violence bolder. Muhammad faced not only rejection, but isolation. Yet in isolation, a greater truth emerged. When every door in Mecca closed, Muhammad did not stop. He did not retreat into grief. He did not alter the mission for comfort. He understood the path ahead could not remain the same. If Mecca could no longer receive the message, another place must. Allah does not close one door without opening another. But before opening it, He leaves His servant stripped of all reliance except on Him. That is the purest form of dependence. When a person no longer says because of someone or through someone, but only for Allah. The year of sorrow was not an ending. It was the starting line of a new journey. A journey no longer shielded by tribal protection or social reverence, but guided entirely by Allah. From the ashes of loss, Islam prepared to leave Mecca, not in weakness, but in profound refinement. And in that seemingly empty moment, history quietly turned. The greatest lesson here is not in history, but in how we view life today. We live in an age obsessed with ease, speed, and guarantees. But real faith is not formed when everything is comfortable. It is formed when nothing remains but Allah. When familiar supports are removed, when plans collapse, when people can no longer save us, that is not when Allah abandons us. It is when He calls us back to our true place. Today, you may not face a boycott, but you may face social isolation. You may not be physically hungry, but you may hunger for meaning, direction, or inner peace. You may not lose loved ones in a single year, but you may be losing faith in yourself or your path. Remember that such seasons are not signs of failure. They may be moments when Allah is refining you, removing misplaced dependence, teaching you to stand through faith. Applying this lesson is not done through grand speeches, but through small choices. Not selling principles to be accepted, not trading conscience for safety, not giving up because the path narrows, and most importantly, not measuring Allah's presence by how easy life feels. If you feel the depth of these lessons and want to explore the history of the prophets, not as distant stories, but as living mirrors for today, join the Prophetic History Explained community. Together, we explore Islamic history, faith, character, and how to live these values with honesty and realism. And do not forget to subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support us in bringing deeper, more meaningful content in future videos. Your presence is part of this journey.